Hamburg sat on the River Elbe like a jewel in Hitler's crown, a vast, crowded port city brimming with shipyards, refineries, factories, and warehouses, and by the summer of 1943 it had become a place the British could not ignore because everything in that city fed the German war machine, Blohm and Voss and other yards that poured steel into U-boats and warships, refineries turning crude into aviation fuel, workshops pressing out tank parts, and docks moving goods that kept armies and fleets alive. The city was also full of ordinary people, families, workers, small shops, narrow streets and old timber houses, and together those two facts, industry and crowded housing, made Hamburg both a military prize and a human tinderbox. For months the Royal Air Force had watched and planned, Bomber Command, under Air Chief Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris. New losses were high, new crews were dying over German skies in numbers that made even hardened officers sick with concern, but he also knew that if the Allies could hurt German production and sap civilian morale, the damage to the Nazi war effort might be more than temporary. The Germans had learned also, from Cologne, from earlier raids, and by 1943 they had turned Hamburg into one of the most heavily defended places in Europe. Hundreds of heavy anti-aircraft guns arranged in overlapping rings, searchlights that could reach for miles and lock onto a bomber like a hunter catching a deer in a beam, and fighter wings stationed nearby so that night fighters could be vectored onto intruders fast and deadly. The German air defense system was, however, a system, radar stations feeding plots into control centers, controllers guiding searchlights and fighters using those electronic eyes, and anti-aircraft batteries calculating firing solutions from the data the sets provided. If those sensors remained clear and the system worked, the defenses could shred an attacking bomber stream. If those sensors were confused, the whole thing could collapse. That was the central gamble and the central opportunity. For more than a year British scientists had quietly perfected a cheap, grotesquely simple trick to blind German radars, thin strips of aluminium foil cut to specific lengths that, when scattered in masses through the sky, would show up as false echoes on the enemy's radar screens and turn neat plots into a stuttering, snow-covered horror of phantom targets. The RAF called the stuff window, the Americans would call it chaff, and to anyone who understood radar it was the death of radar's advantage. For a long time the British government refused to use it because they feared the Germans would learn it and use it against Britain's own radar defences. Fighter Command, which relied on radar to defend British cities from nocturnal Luftwaffe raids, was terrified that using window first would hand the same blindness to the enemy. So the device was locked away, while crews kept flying into the German night and losing planes. By mid-1943 the picture had shifted. The Luftwaffe could no longer mount mass raids on Britain, and RAF losses over Germany were rising to a level that could not be sustained. Harris argued that window was necessary to save his crews and to allow his command to carry out the kind of concentrated attack that would damage German capacity. The decision came in July 1943 and the plan that followed was brutal in its logic and enormous in scale, a massed attack on Hamburg, a target that ticked every box in the hard arithmetic of strategic bombing, shipyards that built U-boats, refineries, transport nodes, and, perhaps more chillingly to the planners, crowded residential districts built of timber and narrow streets where small incendiary bombs could start far more damage than in modern, spaced-out districts. The operation was given a name that could have been ripped from an apocalyptic text, Gomorrah, a biblical city destroyed by fire, and the preparations matched the name. Bomber Command pulled together every heavy bomber available, Lancasters, Halifaxes, Stirlings, Wellingtons, and loaded them with a calculated mix of heavy explosives to blow roofs and water mains open, followed by vast numbers of small incendiaries designed to set everything that would burn alight. Navigators studied maps and photographs until they could find city streets from the stars. Pathfinder crews rehearsed the marking techniques. Thousands of aluminium strips were bundled and tied into releases timed to create a shimmering, falling curtain that would mask the true bomber positions. The night chosen, late July, promised hot, dry weather across northern Germany, a meteorological condition that would, the planners knew, make fires easier to start and harder to stop. When the operation began on the evening of the 24th of July, 1943, the scale was almost impossible to imagine. From airfields across eastern England nearly 800 aircraft took off and headed over the North Sea in a bomber stream that stretched for miles. Men who climbed into those machines were mostly very young, pilots, navigators, bomb aimers, wireless men, gunners, boys by age and in many ways by the desperate hope they carried in their chests. They had flown through flak before, some had lost friends, their faces in pictures show the strain of too many nights and too much noise. As the stream crossed the Dutch coast, crews began to push out window, bundles of closely cut aluminium strips that tumbled and fluttered and multiplied in the air. The German radar operators, watching the screens that had been their reliable eyes for 2 years, suddenly saw chaos. Where once there were clear echoes and neat tracks, now there were thousands of bright returns, a luminous snowstorm on a cathode screen. Controllers tried to adjust knobs and filters, but the screen simply filled. Night fighter control collapsed into confusion. Anti-aircraft batteries, their plotting instruments now unreliable, reverted to blind barrage firing. Searchlights swept the sky, but without radar guidance they could not hold targets. They flickered about like frightened beasts hunting shadows. Some German fighters spent fuel and time doggedly chasing phantoms while real bombers slipped past them towards the city. For the crews in the bombers, the usual terrifying welcome of flak and lights was, almost unbelievably, damped down. There were flashes of bursts below them, a few searchlight beams, but nothing like the wall of controlled, guided fire they had known in other raids. The Pathfinder crews found their aiming points and dropped colored markers on dense working-class districts east of the center, Hammerbrook, Ham, and other old neighborhoods with narrow streets and timbered buildings that were perfect tinder. Then the main force came in. Heavy bombs fell first, huge explosives designed to rip roofs apart, break up buildings and, crucially, smash water mains and other services that would be needed to fight fires. Immediately behind them poured the small incendiaries, thousands and thousands of them, magnesium and other flammable bomblets that scattered across roofs and narrow lanes. What followed was a collision of planning and physics. Each small fire began to burn in its own way, but because they were so densely packed and because the weather that night was hot and still, those individual blazes began to merge. As hundreds or thousands of flames burned in close proximity, their heat columns rose and joined, the rising hot air creating an enormous central updraft. Around that column, air rushed in to feed the flames, and as more air fed the fires, they burned hotter and created more updraft, a feedback loop that, once it passed a certain critical point, became self-sustaining and monstrous. Meteorologists and fire scientists later called the beast that was created a firestorm, and a firestorm is not a large fire in ordinary terms but a new, violent weather system made of heat and flame that creates hurricane-force winds drawing everything towards its center. In Hammerbrook the temperature rose to extremes. People later said the air itself burned. Pavements and asphalt softened, then melted in places. Wooden roofs and beams turned to dry fuel that fed the inferno, canals and rivers, which might have been safety, in places boiled or were full of burning debris carried across by the winds. Air raid shelters that had been built to protect people turned into ovens for those who took refuge, as ventilation systems drew the superheated air of the conflagration into basements and bunkers, lowering oxygen and filling the space with intolerable gases.